Right, awesome. Welcome everyone. Before I start, quick introduction for those who see me for the first time. My name is Nic Wortel. I have my own consultancy firm where I do consulting and training for various companies on various topics, as you can see, like PHP, Symfony, but also more the DevOps side, like containers, Docker, Kubernetes, etc. I'm also a co-organizer of PHP Amersfoort. Shout out if you have ever been there. Hey, PHP Amersfoort, cool. Welcome. Find a seat, don't worry. There's seats left there next to the stairs. Right, so at this talk today, I want to just share some of my experiences as a software engineer throughout my career with different way of applying or not applying Agile and architecture, etc. I hope it will be an interesting story. I hope you will take away some interesting things from it. So let's get started. Yeah. So I want to start with like some part in the beginning of my career. It was like before that I used to I taught myself PHP. I also started with a small company making like very simple websites for local businesses, etc. But at some point I decided I wanted to dive a little bit deeper and go more into like custom application development, which is why I started to look for a job where I could learn so. So one of my first jobs I landed as a junior developer. I became part of a small team, like very small team. There was, including myself, there was 3 developers in the team. And we were just developing an application which was going to be used internally within that company. This application was developed using what I didn't know back then, but now I know as the term waterfall model. Who has worked with the waterfall model in their work? Nice, quite a few hands. Oh, this is really bright, right? I hope not everybody is blinded now suddenly by the white picture. Just a quick recap for those who have not heard of the term before. The waterfall model, it's basically the idea that we try to divide the project in various steps, and like those cascading waterfalls where the water goes down step by step by step, you go from one step to the other, but you usually don't really go back, right? That's the basic law of gravity. Water doesn't go up, it only goes down. So you have different steps, like you start with working out the system requirements, you go into the software requirements, the analysis, then you start to design your program and your architecture, and you do all that stuff before you start actually writing some software, right? And after that, after you've written all the software, you start testing it, and if everything works correctly, then you put it into operation, it goes into production. When I joined this company, they were already gone through a few of those steps, so I actually joined when they already started to program and to write the code for the program. That had a little bit of a downside, because I missed all the steps before that, so I had to figure out on my own, like, okay, why are certain choices made? The actual architecture, and I hope it's still visible with the black background. I had to change it last moment because it used to be white, but I was already told that it would be a little bit too blinding in the dark cinema room. So it was not a super complicated architecture. There was a backend with a database, and the backend exposed a lot of API endpoints. Like for all the functionality, there was an API endpoint, and there was a separate application, which is also a PHP Symfony application, which was actually like doing the front-end stuff. And there was a client library in the middle to help this front-end application to make all the calls to the backend API. So how it worked, like how the architecture was set up, was not so difficult to understand for me. More difficult for me was to understand like why are certain choices made? Because these were not really documented. It was documented how it has to be done. It was clear how it had to be done, but the reasons behind or the arguments behind those decisions were difficult to figure out, and I had to ask around with my colleagues, okay, why was this done like this? Why was it done like that? It was difficult for me to figure it out coming new into the project. Long story short, I'm not going to dive into all the details of what happened at this company, but I just want to point out like there was a few consequences of how this company worked and the decision that was made to follow the waterfall model, because it was a very big upfront investment for the company. We had a team of 3 developers. Of course, it's not as big as having a team of 20 developers, but still, like 3 developers being paid to keep coding and coding and coding. And in the meantime, no value was being created for this company. So up until the point where it would go into production, all this money was an investment, but it didn't pay itself off yet. Actually, after some time, I actually, for various reasons, I again left this company. And as far as I know, this application never got into production. So as far as I know, all this time and money spent into building this application was just being thrown away, basically. That really was for me an eye-opener. Looking back at my experience at this company, it was for me an eye-opener as to what is like the value of working more in what we call agile way of working. So not just go through this waterfall model and have a big risk of maybe never ever ending up in production and just wasting all this time and effort. This is really what got me thinking, okay, there has to be a better way, and start looking more into like agile software development. Sound familiar for anybody, or raise your hand if you had like similar experience, maybe also worked on some tool that never went to the production? Cool. So I'm not the only one. Right, I'm going to skip a few years, go to a different part in my career. In the meantime, I had learned a lot of things about working agile, but also about thinking about systems design and architecture, and how can we design software in a way to make it maintainable, etc. So after a few years, I had a new job opportunity at a new company, and because of this experience that I had gathered in the years in between, I actually managed to become a lead developer there. And the software of the company that I joined, it was actually like a big ball of mud. It was, I would describe it as legacy software. It really did its job great. It created a lot of value for the company. It kept the company in its business and growing. So functionally, it was doing really great, but it became more and more difficult to actually make changes behind the curtains to introduce new functionality or to fix bugs or etc. This was not really the fault of developers. I want to make this clear. Like, it's not just pointing like how could you let this happen. It's just a byproduct that I see many times with companies that have grown quickly in a short period. The software really gives its value, but it's difficult to focus at the same time on keeping everything neat and also to keep building new features to keep the company in business. So it's not the fault of the developers, but it was a matter of not having enough time to keep the software up to date. They got me into this company partly also to help out with this problem and to find ways to make it maintainable again, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So I started there and I started to work out a plan. So what am I going to do to help this company to figure out a way to improve the quality of this software? And there was a few challenges with this, because the system itself, it was already complicated by itself. Like, the functionality was already complicated. It was a very big system. It had to do a lot of different things, and there was only a small team of 6 developers to actually build the software and to maintain it. So there was already like a disbalance between what is the size of our ambitions, like what does the software have to do, and what is the size of the development team that has to maintain it. So the plan actually was to do a rewrite of the system, and because we had already this experience that all of the different parts of the software was already like becoming one big ball of mud, like one big spaghetti code, we actually decided to split it up into multiple microservices. So each bigger part of functionality of the system would become one microservice, and that way we would have clear separation between the different parts and make sure that they stay compartmentalized from each other, right? looking back at my experience there and how I introduced a lot of different ideas in that company, in hindsight, I think I made a few mistakes, and I learned from it, and this is like one of the lessons that I want to share with all of you. I made a few mistakes. So the first mistake was actually to introduce microservices into this company. I heard a lot of people laughing, so I have a feeling that you also maybe have some similar experience as this. So the basic thing I want to point out, I'm not saying that microservices are bad. I'm just saying that they were not the right fit for this company. And why do I think so? Well, first of all, again, because of the small size of the team. Right? There was only one team of 6 developers. And in my experience, the biggest benefit that microservices give you is if you have multiple teams, each team runs their own microservice, and they can deploy and do their things separately from each other. They are not dependent on other teams because they can independently build and deploy their own microservice. Well, in the case of only one team, we didn't have this benefit. So we had all the downsides, we had all the complexity that microservices added, all the extra network stuff and different layers that we had to introduce, but we didn't really get the upside from it. So that's why in hindsight, I think in this specific situation, maybe microservices were not the best idea, and maybe we could have achieved some similar upsides by, for instance, having one monolith with clear separation of different components and having some kind of static analysis tools to enforce those separations. So that was mistake number 1. Mistake number 2 was that in all my eagerness and willingness to help this company, I really started very enthusiastic, and I started to say, we have to do it like this, we have to introduce microservices, we have to introduce this, and that. I was really like taking the role of architect, but not involving the rest of the team. I was telling them more like, this is how we're going to do it, instead of facilitating a discussion within the team, where all the team sits together and discusses together like, hey, how are we going to solve this together? I really learned afterwards that this was a mistake because the more involved the team is, the better the result. And the third mistake that I really want to point out in this talk is I was doing big design upfront. I started to work out my plan. I started to write on a big document of many pages where I started to really describe how all the different things should be solved and how to implement microservices and which logging and monitoring to implement, etc., etc. I was already working out all the details before we even started to write a single letter of code for the system. And why do I point out this decision as a mistake? Because it goes in contradiction to Agile, which, as we remember from my first work experience, was actually my wake-up call, like we shouldn't do waterfall, we should do a little bit more Agile approach. And now I was making the same mistake as that I had encountered before. So I quickly want to point out the Agile Manifesto. If anybody here happened also to be in this room in the previous slot, you have already seen it. And for other people, I assume you have also heard sometime about the Agile Manifesto. But I just want to show it on the screen. The main point of the Agile Manifesto is the 4 values that we value more over the other ones, right? So we have the individuals and interactions, which we say are more important than the processes and tools. Doesn't mean that processes and tools are not important, but whenever they contradict each other, we value the individuals and interactions more than the other, right? Same for working software over comprehensive documentation. It's more important that we ship some working software to our users so that they can start using it and it will create value and we get feedback. That is more important than writing many pages of documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation and responding to change over following a plan. And the one principle that I actually was violating by making this big plan before even starting to write any code is, of course, working software over comprehensive documentation. There's a lot of talks about Agile, and people want to do Agile, and we want to implement Agile. But really, was I being Agile, or was I just saying that I was Agile and still doing waterfall? So that got me thinking later on when I was reflecting on my experiences, and I was thinking like, okay, I should have done that differently, but does that mean that I should not take any time to think about architecture. Like, should we skip architecture because we can only stay agile if we keep delivering new features every 2 weeks? Agile and architecture don't actually contradict each other. That's one of the important points that I figured out. Actually, they go hand in hand. Yeah, apart from the Agile Manifesto that I just showed before, there's also a list of the 12 principles behind the Agile Manifesto. I had to abbreviate them a little bit because otherwise it wouldn't fit on one slide. But here's the 12 principles behind the manifesto. Hey, we want to satisfy the customer with releasing software as early as possible. We welcome the changing requirements. We want to deliver as frequently as possible. It's important that we work together with the business as developers so that we understand each other. Support and trust are really important. Face-to-face conversation. Of course, the working software is the primary measure of progress. We want to be able to maintain a constant pace, and that's actually where it gets interesting, because we all have experienced the situations when the pace is going down and down and down because of technical debt and because of not taking enough time to work out a good architecture, right? But most importantly, I think, when it comes to architecture, is the principle about technical excellence. And I actually have it here in a larger form. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. In other words, we need architecture and we need to think about how are we going to design our systems so that we are able to maintain them without it becoming more and more difficult. And that will actually keep us agile. Because how can we respond to change and how can we respond to business requirements if we have a big legacy project? Yeah, so in other words, having a good architecture and paying attention to architecture will actually makes it easy for us to respond to these changes which we need to solve for the business. So then the question is, how can we design our software and at the same time remain agile, not falling into this trap that I fell in by working out all the details in advance? Yeah, and the answer to that we can partially also find in those agile principles that I mentioned before, those 12 principles. One of them is the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. Going back to my own learning, instead of just telling the team exactly how we're going to do it, make sure that the team is part of this decision-making. Include them in it. Make sure that everybody feels the ownership and everybody works together to decide, okay, how are we going to deal with this? Another interesting principle about this is not from the 12 Agile principles, but I think it's a really good one, is saying the teams that code the system design the system, right? If we are responsible for the software and we are the ones who will have to answer for it if something goes wrong, it also means that we have to be included in the decision making. So when I work as an architect, or if anybody works as an architect, your role is not just to make all the decisions, but more to facilitate the team into making them their own and to help them, to guide them in the right direction. Yeah, going back to the other agile principles, here we have it again. The working software is the primary measure of progress. So in other words, yeah, we're only making progress if we're actually deploying working software. And also, another one of the agile principles, which I also think is really important, is simplicity. So agile itself says simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. So we have to really be careful, okay, what work will we do? What work will we do maybe later but not now? And what work will we do not at all? This also goes for decision making. You may have heard just in time, GIT, it's a commonly thrown expression also in the agile context. So if we have to make decisions about our architecture, we want to make them just in time, not 3 months in advance, but just as soon enough as we need them, and not too late, of course. That goes a little bit hand in hand with this this example that I found, which I really like, is figuring out, like, when I make a decision, which decisions do I need to take a lot of time to make them, and I have to be very careful, and which decisions can I make just quickly and maybe at a later point because they're easy to change later on in the process. Yeah, so we have this, this overview. On the left side, we see how big is the impact of making a wrong decision, like how much work will it cost us to later fix it by doing it again or doing it in a different way. And on the bottom, we see the time spent for making this decision. And we can see if the impact of a bad decision is very high, but we make the decision very quickly, so there's a low time spent, it means that we're being reckless. And it means that we take not enough time to think about it, and later on we will get into big trouble. So my fault, or my mistake, was to be too afraid to make reckless decisions, because I had seen, of course, the impact of such reckless decisions before, and also at that company I had a big ball of mud. Some of it was maybe because of reckless decisions. So I was being actually too cautious. So what I was doing, actually, I was in the bottom right. I was, even for the decisions with a low impact, I was still taking a lot of time, trying to work it all out in advance, and I was thereby too cautious. So my advice, of course, is to make sure that you first figure out for any decision that you are going to make, figure out, okay, what is going to be the impact of this decision? What if I make this decision too late, or what if I make the wrong decision? Is there a big problem with it, or is it easy to change it later on, and I should just not take so much time to make this decision right now? Next thing I want to talk about is recording these decisions, this architecture decision, because that's actually what I ran into in this first job where I joined as a junior developer. I was running into a lot of decisions where the actual decisions were clear, but I was actually missing some information about, okay, but why did we make this decision? What if the context changed in the meantime? And what if by now this is no longer the best decision? So this is really the main point I want to make in this talk, is to find a way how you record not just the outcome of the decision, but actually also the rest of the decision-making process, so that later on you can verify if those decisions are still valid or not. Who here has ever joined a new company or a new team and was looking at documentation of ways how to do things in that team, and you were thinking like, okay, but why? Why is this decision made? For me, sometimes it looked a little bit like this. Yeah, but instead of being able to read the documentation, I usually had to ask around various people, like, okay, but why did you make this decision? And then most of the time, the reasons made actually sense, but it would just be so much more easy for me if I could just read this in a central place. Yeah, so if we are talking about this, I first want to elaborate on a few terms that I'm going to talk about, just to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, right? So if we're talking about an architectural decision, it means that we have a justified choice in the design of our software, which is about a functional or a non-functional requirement that is really significant for the architecture and for the working of the system, right? Usually those are decisions that are hard to make and or are difficult or costly to change later on in the process. So if you remember the previous graph, the ones with a high impact on making the wrong decision. Yeah, and when I'm talking about an architecturally significant requirement, I'm talking about a requirement that has some kind of measurable effect on the software. For example, maybe the performance, like how long does it take to generate a response, or how long does it take to fix a bug in the system, some kind of thing that is measurable. Just to elaborate, when I'm talking about this kind of decisions, it's not the kind of decision like coding style or tabs versus spaces or anything else that is just easily fixable by some kind of linter or PHP code sniffer or any kind of tool. Yeah, we're talking really about the bigger, more fundamental decisions in building a project. For example, that could be like, which programming language are we going to use? Of course, we are at PHP conference, so it could be PHP, but maybe you have a good reason to not use PHP for a certain project. So that is a decision that you should make deliberately, and not just saying like, yeah, we always do PHP, so let's do PHP, because maybe there's another solution that's a lot better for this situation. Same thing for a framework, or for what kind of, are you going to use hexagonal architecture or layered architecture, or what kind of architecture? How are you going to use network communication protocols, a database system, etc., etc. Right? So these are like bigger decisions that are going to be more costly to change later on, and it's a good idea to make those a deliberate decision. So one tool that I have found for myself, and which I really like, to like record this kind of decisions and to make sure that later on we can still remember how and why we made these decisions, is what is called the architectural decision record. Anybody heard of it? Nice, okay. So whenever I work with some client who has the same, or is walking into the same issues as I described before, like, hey, we're making decisions, but either we're taking them too rushed, or we don't remember later on why we made this decision. This is really my favorite tool to solve this. Yeah, so for each decision that we make some kind of record, and if you combine a number of those records, then together you get what is called a decision log. Yeah, so we can just see the log, we can see in order which decisions were made in the history of this project. Again, which big important decisions, and not things like tabs versus spaces. So there's a few ways how you can structure these decision records, right? I'm going to show two of them. There's of course more different formats, but I want to just show two of them which I really like. Yeah, so there's this guy, Michael Nygaard, who some time ago wrote a blog post introducing this concept of the architectural decision records. And the format that he proposes is actually those five headers. So you start with a title describing your decision. Then you describe the context in which the decision is made. For example, if we're talking about choosing a programming language, of course it's relevant that all your programmers already know PHP. That is definitely important in your context. But if you have a project where you have to do a lot of low-level data manipulation, then it may be a reason to maybe also consider some other language. Yeah. So what is the context that you're operating in? The second point, the third point is actually your decision, like the outcome of your decision. Like, okay, we're going for PHP, or we're going for Go, or we're going for whatever. Yeah, so that's the outcome of the decision. Then you can have a status, which is basically is most of the time is going to be accepted, but it can also be that over the years you have revisited this decision and you have made a new decision, which is going in another direction, and then the earlier decision is of course no longer current, but it's like outdated or superseded. Yeah, and you describe the consequences of the decision. So what is going to be the consequences of the decision? Because those consequences may actually provide the context for one of your next decisions. Yeah, so here's just a short example. I hope it's readable for everybody. I really had to compress it a little bit because usually you want to be a little bit more verbose, but if I show a big document, then it's just not readable on the slides anymore. Yeah, so we have a title, the context, a decision, a status, and what are the consequences of making this decision. Another template or another format for these decisions that I also really like is abbreviated matter or markdown any decision records. I think it started with markdown architectural decision records, but they have made it more generic, so you can also use it for other decision making. Basically, it's mostly the same. Like you see some similar titles. What I really like about this one is that it also forces you to list the considered options, to really make sure that you're not just writing it as an exercise, but you already have made your decision. But really, you have to go to compare different options, and even you can write down the pros and cons of the various options. It really makes it useful for later on. If you check it out 2 years later, and you think like, why did we go for that option again? I can just see the pros and cons, and maybe some of the pros and cons don't apply to me anymore right now, or there's new different pros and cons. So here's an example. Again, a really, I had to make it a little bit short, but another example in this other format of the same decision-making process. So what are the benefits? I already touched a few of them, but what are the benefits of using this architecture decision records? Yeah, so first of all, of course, we have some kind of documentation, and it doesn't have to be many pages, but we document our decision, which is very useful for new team members or for looking back at our decision sometime later. But we also record the reasons behind why we made this decision, and that is for me the most important benefit. As I said before, especially if you use the matter format, you're kind of being forced to make this decision more deliberate. You're not just thinking like, yeah, I really like MySQL, so I'm just going to take MySQL. No, you really get forced a little bit to make a decision between various options, so you don't make the decision too fast, because sometimes the first thing that we think about or want to do may not always be the best decision. Yeah, it allows to reevaluate these decisions in the future, and that is especially important, I think, in an agile context, right? With working or being agile, we accept the fact that the context and the business requirements can change over time, right? We don't just assume that we're going to do this waterfall project for 3 years, and that 3 years later everything will still be the same. We actually accept that the situation can change, and by documenting our decisions in such a way, it makes it much more easier to later reevaluate them. Yeah, and last but not least, they build upon each other, right? So the decision that we make in the beginning will form the context for a new decision, and by having them in a log in the right order, we can actually follow it in this order, and it really makes sense when we read it. A few recommendations that I want to make if you decide to try this out and to implement some architectural decision records in your own team. First of all, be objective. As I said before, sometimes we already have a bias, or we already know some tool and we know it works really well. So make sure that you are actually objective and not just writing the architectural decision record in such a way that it will automatically have your preferred solution as a consequence. Yeah, so make sure that you don't just list the positive, the pros of any option, but also make sure that you really look for some of the cons. In hindsight, if I would have followed this process when I decided to go for the microservices, it would have forced me to look a little bit more, okay, I'm not just seeing the positive sides of the microservices, but what are the downsides? What are the extra complexity that I'm introducing with it? If I would follow this process, I may not have chosen that option. Keep them brief. As I mentioned, the ones that I showed in the slides were really brief, like a little bit less brief than that, but don't make them 20-page documents. It's supposed to be giving just enough information to make it clear why and how that decision was being made. If you do find that you are making a decision that is really complex and doesn't fit into like 1 page or something, then you have to consider the possibility like maybe it's not actually just one decision, but I'm making multiple decisions as once, and then try to split them into separate decisions so that we have really like atomic commits, but we have atomic decisions, right? Yeah, choose one of the templates. As I said, I showed 2 of them, but there's more. Just choose one that you like in your team, and then try to stick with it. Yeah, again, we're agile, so if we decide in 1 year that this template is really not working for us, of course you can change it, but try to be as consistent as possible so that you have a nice log which is easy and consistent to read. Yeah, give them, again, some numbers so that you can easily figure out, okay, which decision was made first and which was made after that, so it makes sense when you read it in that order. And really important, I think, is try, if you like this as a team, of course, but try to store them actually in your Git repo. If we're working on a project, we have all the source code of that project in one Git repo. It makes sense, in my opinion, to also store your architectural decision records there. Yeah, you can store it, of course, also in some Confluence or some wiki or whatever, but it will be further away from your code, so it will be less easy to find for new people. If it just contained in the same repo, it's all together, makes it much more discoverable. Also, one benefit, of course, is because we have it in Git, we have some history, so we can even see if we made some changes later on, we can see the history of our decision record. Yeah, if you decide to put them in your Git repo, it works really well in my experience to write them as Markdown files, which are easy to read and easy to write for people. And it will automatically be rendered by most of the Git hosting services like GitHub, GitLab, etc. So you have nice rendering, they're nice to read, and also still easy to write. If you are making them in Markdown, the next nice step, in my opinion, is to also, if you write or if you create any diagrams to make things visual, which is of course a good idea, to actually create those diagrams also using code. Because especially if you're being agile and you want to change your architecture maybe later on, it's really annoying if you have to rewrite the whole diagram because you only have some PNG and you are not able to modify it anymore because the one who designed it used some custom tool and we don't have access anymore, etc. Yeah, so there's nice tools like Mermaid, also other tools which allow you to write a little bit of code and it will automatically generate some diagram for you. So here's an example. Again, I hope that the arrows are visible with the black background. But on the top you see some example Mermaid code that I wrote. And on the bottom you actually see the rendered result. And again, tools like GitHub and I think also GitLab and others will automatically render those if they are in your Markdown files. So you just write the code and on the GitHub you automatically see the rendered result. There's also plugins for PHP Storm, Visual Studio Code, etc. So it's an easy way to create some diagram, and later on it will be easy to change without having to redo all of it. I'm going to move to wrapping up this talk. Some of the few main takeaways that I want to reiterate. Again, architecture and agile, they don't have to be enemies. Actually, they go very well hand in hand, as long as you make sure that you don't do all the design up front. Yeah, so make your decisions just in time, just at the moment where you actually need to make them, and not 3 months in advance. As I said, involve the team. Make sure that if you have some kind of architecture role, make sure that you're not just telling everybody how to do it, but involve everybody, create ownership, make sure that everybody is involved and feels responsible for it. Yeah, and of course, I really like the architectural decision records as a tool to document your decisions and the reasoning behind them. If you want to read more specifically about architecture decision records, I can really recommend this GitHub site, adr.github.io, which contains a lot of valuable resources about using ADRs. It also contains some links to various tools that you can use if you like to write them for you or to help you write those records in the various formats. I want to finish off with some little bit self-promotion. I am talking now, of course, about architecture and agile, but I also give various training courses in various things regarding PHP and DevOps and Docker and Kubernetes. If you're interested, save this discount code. You can get a 10% discount for joining one of those training sessions. I want to thank you very much for attending. I hope you liked it. I do have one request for everybody. Please take out your phone, scan this QR code. It will send you to my to the joined-in page for this talk session, because I'm curious to hear any feedback about how I presented this talk and if you have any suggestions to do it better the next time. So please take some time. I would be really thankful if you do so. Also, of course, you can contact me via Twitter or via my website if you want to also give some feedback. And this was the last slide. I think we have some time for questions, right?
Yes. Anybody? That's easy.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question. Do you have some tips about how to encourage adoption of this process? Because it's still, after all, a process, right? And then
of the architectural decision record specifically.
Yeah.
Some tips for adoption. Well, first of all, come to my talk. But yeah, talk about it in your team. I'm not saying that hey, this is also one of those decisions where I'm not saying like you should just enforce the team to follow this process, but talk about it with your team, see if they ever experienced the same situation, like, hey, looking back a few years, why did we make this decision again? We forgot about the reasoning, or we maybe rushed this decision and didn't really think it through when we had to. I would start this conversation with the team, like, do they feel need for this? And if they don't, if there's no pain point that leads to implementing something like this, yeah, then why would you implement it?
Thank you.
See one in the back there? It's good for your exercise. Steps count.
Yeah, hello, thank you. The question is, maybe you meet some situations when the business is so rough and the situation is so hard that the team cannot afford to implement a good practice like a documentation, a good code. So requirements are like have strong deadlines and so on and so on. So what to do in this situation if we have not enough time and we will, for example, need to implement a payment system rules that are concurrent? Thank you.
So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking like, okay, if there's like a lot of pressure on the team to deliver features, we have difficulty to find time to implement this kind of process, then my first question would be like, is there no time to document the outcome, or is there no time to actually make the decision?
It's no time actually to make decisions.
Yeah.
And the concurrency is, for example, pushing us back from our market. So what?
Sorry, one more time. What did you say?
Sorry.
What was the last sentence you said? I missed.
So let's say the concurrent, like the another company can push our business out to the company, so company can like to be closed if we will not implement some features in time. So what can we do? Do we need to implement the best practices, or it's better to focus on a coding and even if code is it's bad, even if it's no documentation and no like the best practices?
So in my opinion, there's not something like skipping design decisions. You make them either way. You make them either deliberately and explicitly, or you make them implicitly and maybe not thinking it through. And then you come to the point where making them in a hurry, it can actually damage you on the long run. So if you're talking about, hey, I want to stay competitive as a business, I think that's actually where Agile comes in, right? Because being Agile makes it that we can easily respond to changes or to new requests from the market. And yeah, as I mentioned in my talk, the Agile and architecture go hand in hand. So actually, sometimes it just makes sense to take a step back, think about it a little bit. On the short run, maybe it will take you a little bit longer, but on the long run, you will stay agile. You will be able to maneuver quickly and to respond to changes in the market. And that's how I think you can stay ahead of your competition. Of course, there's like exceptions to this, like if you're just if you're making some project that only lives for a short while and you just want to get it out as quickly as possible, but then, these architectural decisions have maybe less impact because the project doesn't live long enough to really experience the downsides of working with this big ball of mud. But in general, if you have if you're working on a project that has to stay in the business for a long time, I definitely believe that it's worth to take a little bit of time to think through how are we going to make this decision instead of just skipping the decision and making it implicitly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's very clear. Thank you.
Right.
We have time for one more question. Okay.
This guy can run the marathon after today.
So you mentioned making decisions and consequences.
Yeah.
And then you said if it's too fast and the harm is not bad, that's fine. You shouldn't spend too much time on decisions that don't have big consequences. Is there something that come to mind to you when like, okay, now it's too long, too much time, now it's too short? Because sometimes you don't know for sure until later, right? What are the consequences of the decisions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's always difficult, of course, and I think it comes partially with experience. So that's why I still think that even though teams should be more empowered to make their own decisions on architecture, it's still good to have someone in an architecture role who has experience with this and who can guide them a little bit and warn them like, hey, what you're doing now maybe has consequences later on. But you want some specific examples, or?
I want something that come to you in mind immediately when you are thinking about making decisions. Like,
Yeah.
is there some tips?
Yeah. So. I'm double checking if I understand correctly. Like, if you mean some concrete examples, like what I mentioned in the slides, like when I was making all this plan of how to make this shiny new platform where everything is shiny rainbows and unicorns, I was even working out, okay, what coding standards are we going to follow, what code style rules, and these are, I think, a clear example in hindsight of things that we could easily have decided later, even after we already started coding, because it's just a matter of running a code style tool and it will fix it for us. So that's, I think, an example of where I was being too cautious and I was taking too much time in advance to make a decision that was easy to revert later on. Yeah, microservices is one that is, of course, a lot more difficult to. It's still possible. It's just going to take a lot of time to redo it and to come back from such a decision. Yeah, and it comes in both ways. If you decide first we're going to do a monolith and then later microservices, it can be easy. It can be difficult to detangle it. But also, if you decide, hey, we're going all the way from microservices and we're going to put a lot of time and effort into setting everything up, and then later we decide it could have just been a monolith, it's also a lot of wasted time. Does that answer the question, or if not, please come by and we can discuss it further.
All right, thank you, Nic. Big applause for Nic.